Hello, welcome to Brad Explains the Law. Today I'm going to explain the limited liability company. Now for a message from this guy. Sorry for the interruption, but it's important that I tell you that this video is not legal advice. It's only general information and opinion of Brad Hamilton. If you need legal advice, you should contact a lawyer who can advise you on your specific facts and issues. Also, this video doesn't create a lawyer-client relationship between you and me or my law firm. In other words, I'm not your lawyer unless we sign an engagement agreement. Now, back to the program. In my last video, I explained the corporation, a legal entity authorized to do business under state law that provides its shareholders and investors with limited liability. Although, that sounds a little bit like a limited liability company because it's in the name, a limited liability company. So what's the difference between a corporation and an LLC? Primarily, it's tax. Sorry, my brain freezes a little bit. Whenever I think about the tax code, I'll edit those brain freezes out. So primarily, it's about tax and flexibility. But to explain what an LLC is, first we need to understand why an LLC is. To understand why an LLC is, we need to go back in time a little bit. Again, you'll find I do this a lot. You'll recall when I was talking about corporations, I explained that in the beginning of human commerce, throughout human history, most of the time, people were personally liable for whatever debts and damages they incurred. So if you sold a guy some chickens and the chickens made him sick, he came directly to you. You couldn't say, oh, I have limited liability because those chickens were owned by a corporation. That didn't exist. As I mentioned in my corporations video, beginning around the year 1000, but actually it was before that. Even clear back in Roman times, they had the concept of a limited partnership and a limited liability for investors in commercial enterprises, and that became more formalized through the Italian city-states around the year 1000. And around the year 1600, corporations began to be formed. By the time the United States was formed, and states began enacting corporation laws, you really had two entities for conducting business. One was the joint stock company or the corporation, and the other was a partnership or a limited partnership, where the limited partners would not be liable for the debts of the partnership, but somebody had to be liable, and that was the general partner. Or if it was a regular partnership, all of the partners were liable. So you really just had two choices: a partnership, two choices there, limited partnership or a regular partnership, but partnership, and the corporation. And those were your only two choices for 100 or so years, at least from the late 1800s until about 1946, just after the Second World War, when all the GIs were coming home and needed jobs and were starting businesses. Congress enacted a new section of the tax code called Subchapter S. Subchapter S authorized the election for a corporation to be taxed under Subchapter S of the tax code, which provided its owners with flow-through taxation, sort of like a partnership. Now, to explain this tax effect and the difference between corporations, S Corps, and partnerships, we're going to go to the whiteboard. The operations of a business enterprise can give rise to liability from things like injuring people and borrowing money. Those same business operations give rise to income and the obligation to pay taxes. Let's look at liability first. With a corporation, liability stops here. Same thing with a corporation that has elected to be taxed under Subchapter S. Keep in mind that each limitation of liability depends on the entity doing the things that's necessary to preserve what we call the liability veil. With a partnership, liabilities flow through to the partners. With a limited partnership, liability flows through to the general partner. The limited partners maintain limited liability. With a limited liability company, liability also stops at the company just like it does for a corporation. Now, let's look at the flow of money and the obligation to pay taxes. With a traditional corporation taxed under Subchapter C, the corporation must pay taxes to the IRS on its profits. Then, when the corporation distributes money out to its shareholders, they pay taxes to the IRS and states on that income. Every dollar of taxable income is taxed twice, once at the corporate level and then again at the shareholders. With a subchapter S corporation, the taxable income flows through. The corporation does not have to pay taxes. The shareholders pay taxes. So each dollar is taxed only once. Same thing with a partnership. Same thing with a limited partnership. Same thing with a limited liability company. But with an S corporation, there's lots of rules. Rules about who can be a shareholder. And you have no flexibility in allocating and distributing your profits. They must be allocated to each shareholder pro rata. With a limited liability company, you have limited liability, but you don't have any rules about who can be an owner, and you don't have rules about how you can allocate profits and losses among the members. It doesn't have to be pro rata to each member's ownership interest, so long as there's a substantial economic effect. That's a tax rule that's beyond the scope of this presentation. It starts to get pretty complicated. With a regular C corporation, every dollar is taxed twice. That's what we call double taxation. You can avoid double taxation with an S Corp, but there's lots of rules you have to follow. You avoid double taxation with a partnership and a limited partnership, but the liability flows through to the partners or the general partner in a limited partnership. You avoid double taxation with an LLC, and liability stops with the company, and you have flexibility in your ownership. Now, let's look at the hierarchy of ownership and management between corporations and limited liability companies. A corporation, whether it's an S corporation or a C corporation, is owned by its shareholders, who elect or appoint the directors, who elect or appoint the officers and control the direction of the company and control the officers, who manage the day-to-day operations of the corporation, while the directors manage the strategic vision and the bigger picture operations of the corporation. These are required by statute. Directors and officers are required by statute. They can be the same people, but they are required by law. A limited liability company, however, is owned by its members. They're called members to distinguish them from shareholders in corporations, so people won't get confused. So the owners of a limited liability company are its members. The members, a limited liability company can be manager managed or member managed. If it's manager managed, the members appoint, elect the managers, just like shareholders elect directors, and the managers can appoint or elect officers. Officers aren't required for a limited liability company like they are for a corporation, but you may have them if you want them. If there's no officers, the managers control the direction and day-to-day operations of the company. If there's officers, the officers control the day-to-day direction of the company, while the managers control the strategic vision and the bigger pictures. In this case, with a manager-managed limited liability company, it looks just like a corporation. But a limited liability company can also be member-managed. Member-managed LLC can appoint officers, but it's not required. If it doesn't have officers, then the members run the day-to-day operations of the company. There's lots of reasons not to have a member-managed limited liability company. Member-managed limited liability company is normally appropriate only with a very small business with a few folks who are going to be helping one another run the business. So just to be clear, you can't form an S Corp. You can't form a C Corp. You can form a corporation. Corporations are formed under state law. You can elect to have your corporation taxed under subchapter S of the tax code. And that election's filed with the federal government. It has nothing to do with the formation or registration of your corporation with the state. Those elections can be filed within a couple of months after you form your corporation, or if you want to do it later, you can do it at the beginning of every tax year. You can file the form necessary to have your corporation taxed as an S Corp, which means taxed under Subchapter S of the Internal Revenue Code. So now, after 1954, we have three choices. We have a regular corporation taxed under Subchapter C of the Internal Revenue Code. We have partnerships, can be a limited partnership or a general partnership. Either way, provides flow-through taxation to its partners. And we have the S Corp, which also provides flow-through taxation to its partners, to its shareholders, and limited liability. But both partnerships and S Corps have lots of rules under the tax code. So for example, an S Corp, you can't have any entities as shareholders. You can only have one class of stock. You cannot have any foreign shareholders. You cannot have more than 100 shareholders. So there's a whole bunch of rules, and if you're going out to raise money or your company's growing, then it probably doesn't make any sense to have an S Corp anymore, but it's hard to change it. It can have a bad tax effect if you change the tax election of an S Corp. But if S corporations have a lot of rules, back in the day, partnerships had more rules. In order to qualify for partnership taxation, and this is under Subchapter K of the Internal Revenue Code, a partnership could not have the characteristics of a corporation. Those characteristics include continuity of life, centralized management, limited liability, and free transferability of interest. Pretty important things if you're an investor or an owner in a corporation. In order to qualify for partnership taxation, which is flow-through taxation, the partnership had to lack two of those four corporate characteristics. So from about 1946 until 1947, those were the three choices for people who wanted to form an entity to do business. A corporation, which is subject to double taxation because limited liability. A partnership, but your partnership agreement and your partnership rules had to follow those requirements that I just mentioned in order to have flow-through taxation. Or an S corporation with a lot of rules about who can be owners in an S corporation. So not providing a lot of flexibility, but providing limited liability. So both corporation forms provide limited liability to their investors and owners. The partnership does not, unless it's a limited partnership, and then it does provide limited liability to its limited partners, but not its general partner. What's missing in this scheme? What's missing is an entity that provides limited liability, flow-through taxation, is not subject to double taxation, and flexibility. Who can be owners? How can you manage it? What can it own? That is missing. Until in 1977, some really smart people up in Wyoming conceived and passed the first Limited Liability Company Act. Now, it wasn't like they invented it. Limited liability companies of a sort existed in other countries. In South America and some of the Latin American companies, they had the limitada, which was a form of limited liability company. Now, it's not 100% comparable because the tax codes in other countries aren't the same as the tax code here. But there were some similarities, so ideas could be born about other types of entities. Also in Germany, they have the GmbH, GmbH, the Gesellschaft mit bereitet Haftung, which translates into limited liability company. So these have been around for a while in other countries, but not in the United States. So in 1997, Wyoming passed the first Limited Liability Company Act. But in order to make sure that every limited liability company formed under the Wyoming Limited Liability Company Act, well, that's a mouthful, could qualify for flow-through taxation to the owners, the rules in the statute for forming and operating a limited liability company included requirements for things like no continuity of life, no centralized management, no free transferability of shares. If a member in an LLC died, then the LLC had to dissolve. That was to make sure that a limited liability company formed under the Act would qualify for flow-through transaction. These were very long and complicated. This Wyoming Act, it was a fairly long and complicated with what lawyers call default rules. If you look at the Corporation Act of each state, you'll see there's a whole lot of what lawyers call default rules. These default rules are the rules about how the corporation is formed and operated. So it's about the things that directors can do and shareholders can do and officers can do, and when you can have meetings and when you're supposed to have meetings and how much notice you have to give and what books and records they can inspect and things like that. We call those default rules. Oh man, the default rules for the first limited liability company acts were even longer because they had to comply with subchapter K, magical subchapter K of the tax code. But it was a long time before, because the IRS doesn't really, they're not known for their forward thinking and progressive action. So it took a long time before Wyoming could be certain that a limited liability company formed under the Wyoming Act would in fact qualify for flow-through taxation. Nevertheless, in 1982, some brave souls in Florida also passed a Limited Liability Company Act, very similar to the Wyoming Act. But it wasn't until 1988 when the Internal Revenue Service issued a ruling saying that a limited liability company formed under the Wyoming Act or the Florida Act, or maybe it was just the Wyoming Act, wouldn't matter, the acts were the same, did qualify for flow-through taxation. Then, in 1990, Colorado became the third state to pass a Limited Liability Company Act. Being the forward-thinking state that we are, fairly progressive with respect to corporate matters, we beat Delaware to having a Limited Liability Company Act. Now, the three acts, Wyoming, Florida, and Colorado, were all what we call bulletproof acts. The default rules that I was talking about in the acts were so detailed and so mandatory that if you formed and operated a limited liability company in accordance with those acts, you were bulletproof to be sure of having flow-through taxation as a partnership under subchapter K of the Internal Revenue Code. Then 2 years later, Delaware got into the act and they passed a Limited Liability Company Act, but it wasn't bulletproof. Its default rules were more flexible. They gave people who formed a Delaware limited liability company more choices and more flexibility in forming their limited liability company. Delaware left it up to the people who formed the limited liability companies in Delaware to comply with the rules to be taxed as a partnership or not, as they chose, which is fairly dangerous because a lot of people who form entities certainly don't understand, especially back then, the rules of subchapter K of the Internal Revenue Code, which are, just mind-blowingly complex even today after everything is more simplified. In fact, that reminds me, when I was in law school, when I took tax, I sat in the front row. I knew tax was going to be hard for me. And I sat in the front row right in front of the professor and with a yellow pad, and I wrote down every word that guy said. He was a really good professor, Professor Dickinson. I wrote until my hands cramped every day. Sitting next to me was Bill Colby, a renowned lawyer and author. And Bill would sit back in his chair like this for most of the lecture. And once or twice every lecture, he would lean forward and write down a word or a phrase or something like that. And I thought, what the heck is this guy doing? Bill got an A in tax, and I did not get an A in tax. Anyway, I digress. In 1993, the IRS approved Colorado's Limited Liability Act for flow-through taxation. A couple of years later, the IRS considered two cases of Delaware LLCs. One in the operating agreement. The operating agreement is the document that controls the operations and the governance of a limited liability company. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. The operating agreement of one of them had all the rules required for flow-through taxation, no continuity of life, no centralized management, no free transferability of ownership. The other operating agreement didn't have those things. It was more flexible. The IRS ruled that the one with the default rules in the operating agreement qualified for flow-through taxation, and the one without them did not. So now if you have a Delaware LLC, you potentially have some risk. I mean, if you didn't consult with a tax lawyer in forming that LLC and drafting that operating agreement, you were at risk of losing your flow-through tax eligibility. Then in 1997, everything changed because the IRS enacted what are called the check-the-box rules. The check-the-box rules took away everything that had to do with qualifying for flow-through taxation, all that stuff about what's a corporation look like. Just threw it away and said, here's a list. Check the box. Do you want to be taxed under subchapter C as a C Corp? Or do you want to be taxed under subchapter S as an S Corp? Or do you want to be taxed under subchapter K as a partnership? Check your box and choose however you want to be taxed. And you can do that at the beginning of every year until I think March 15th. Don't hold me to that. That's just off the top of my head, but I think it's March 15th, beginning of every year. You can change your tax classification. So the whole thing blew up. And from that point forward, all the states started passing limited liability company acts, with Colorado and Delaware being the most forward-thinking, and Delaware being a little more activist in taking what's now called a contractarian approach. Yeah, that's also a mouthful. So what that means is, over a period of years, starting with 1998, Delaware started taking away what default rules they had. Colorado still had a lot of default rules because its act was bulletproof. Colorado started taking away its default rules until we come today. So these acts were amended over and over and over again. Today, both Delaware and Colorado limited liability company acts hardly have anything in them. It says you can form a limited liability company, and you do it by filing articles of organization, where in Delaware it's called a certificate of formation because Delaware's always got to be different from everybody else. You file it, you form it, it exists, it has limited liability, and the rest is up to you. You can do whatever you want, which is kind of interesting because corporation acts still have lots of default rules. Partnership acts and limited liability company acts don't have much in the way of default rules anymore, leaving tons of flexibility, which can be great if you're a business person and you want a lot of flexibility, but it's particularly great for lawyers because now there's no default rules anymore. Everything has to be in the operating agreement. If you form a limited liability company today and you don't have an operating agreement, or in Delaware, it's called a limited liability company agreement instead of an operating agreement because Delaware has to be different from everybody else. If you don't have that agreement, you don't have any default rules. There's nothing in the statute that says you have to have an annual meeting, or you're managed by members, or you're managed by managers, or what they have to do, or what books and records. There's just nothing there. It all goes in the operating agreement. And more than that, the default tax treatment for a limited liability company is as a partnership, subchapter K. So if you want it to be taxed some other way, you got to check the box and file it with the IRS. If you're taxed as a partnership and you don't have certain tax elections, what are called special allocations and some other things, in your operating agreement, then the IRS can make elections for you, particularly if they audit you. And if they do that, they're going to make the elections that cause you to pay the most tax. Imagine that. So your operating agreement, if the LLC is going to be taxed as a partnership, your operating agreement also needs to have lots of tax elections and tax provisions in it. And you can get into, this is kind of beyond the scope of this video, but you can do special allocations and preferred distributions and profit units. I'll talk about profit units in a little bit. in a later video. It gets pretty complicated. This is why I'm not a tax lawyer, and it's why my brain freezes up sometimes when I think about the tax code. So the operating agreement now takes the place of what used to be the default rules. You used to go to the statute, and there's a big long statute and lots of rules, and now it all has to be in the operating agreement. So if you're forming a limited liability company, if you have a limited liability company and it's going to be taxed as a partnership, you need a good operating agreement that applies specifically to your company and your business, and not one that you pull off of the internet. Limited liability companies have come a long way in the last few years. There's now something called a series limited liability company. I believe Delaware was the first, but now several states have allowed for series limited liability companies. So a series limited liability company is you form a limited liability company and then you divide it into series. So it's like a bunch of mini limited liability companies within one limited liability company. And each series of a limited liability company can own its own assets. And now, thanks to some changes under the Delaware Act, if it files a certificate for the series, a series certificate, it can have limited liability restricted to the assets of that particular series. Now, that sounds pretty complicated, and it kind of is. So why? Why does that exist? What it does is it allows fund managers, instead of using a Massachusetts trust, which is the most common entity, to hold separate groups of assets for what's called a securitization or structured finance. Using a series limited liability company to some extent is a little bit easier than having a Massachusetts trust or a Delaware trust. That's getting well beyond the scope of Brad Explains the Law, which is supposed to be for lay people and not sophisticated lawyers. So it's getting kind of complicated. If you've ever seen The Big Short, that is a perfect description of structured finance. There were no series limited liability companies, I don't think, when and that's about the housing crash, the 2008, 2009 recession. If there were series limited liability companies at that time, they probably would have used them. So now, over time, the law has developed for limited liability companies to be the entity that has no rules about who can own it, because these rules about who can own an S corporation, those still exist. Having a check the box election doesn't affect those rules. So if you have an S Corp today, just like in the 1950s and 1946 when they were first allowed, you still can't have entity owners, you can't have foreign owners, you can't have multiple classes of stock, and so on. Those rules still apply. But now the limited liability company fills that hole that didn't exist before 1997. That an entity that has no rules about who the owners are, you have ultimate flexibility to do whatever you want in that respect. It provides its owners with limited liability, and it provides flow-through taxation. So after all those efforts, we finally got the entity that provides those three features, which are very important, but can be very important, particularly to startups who might have a lot of capital expenditures to begin, and its founders want to take the losses from all of those initial expenditures on their personal tax returns, and provides limited liability. And because limited liability companies are really quite new relative to the history of law, things don't usually evolve very quickly in the law, but they did evolve very quickly, relatively speaking, for limited liability companies. And because they're relatively new, the law is continuing to evolve fairly rapidly with limited liability companies. To summarize, a limited liability company is formed under state law, just like a corporation. It provides its investors and owners with limited liability so long as they operate the company with the requirements necessary to maintain limited liability. It provides flow-through taxation with no rules about governance or structure or ownership. And it provides ultimate flexibility with almost no default rules in the statute on how you can govern, structure, and handle the finances of your limited liability company. Thanks for watching Brad Explains the Law. If you'd like to see my next video, subscribe right down there. And if you have a topic you would like me to explain, send me an email at lawofbiz@gmail.com. That's lawofbiz@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.